Welcome to this month's edition of our Powered by webinar series. Today we are powered by ReEDS. Just wanted to go over a couple of housekeeping items before we really get underway here. Stuart, if you could advance to the next slide, please. Thank you. So just so you guys know, this webinar is being recorded. It's going to be posted publicly afterward. Everyone's mics and videos are going to be muted for the duration, but you can still submit your Q&A, your questions, in the box at the bottom of your Zoom panel, and we'll go over them all at the end. So please feel free to provide your feedback. We're going to send out a form after the webinar for you to do that. So with that, I'm going to turn things over now to our speaker, Stuart Cohen. He is a senior researcher on the capacity expansion and electricity markets team here at NREL. And with that, Stuart, it's all yours.
Great. Thanks a lot, Tim. So welcome. Thanks everyone for joining. Like Tim said, I'm in the capacity expansion electricity markets group at NREL. Been here for coming up on 12 years now and done a wide range of different projects, many and really most of them involving the ReEDS model. So excited to talk to everyone about that tool today, and hopefully all can learn something, and look forward to hearing questions and thoughts at the end. So what I'm going to do is really start with a really brief history of ReEDS, just to give you a sense of where it came from, and then give an overview of what the ReEDS model does, how it's been used in the past and is being used today, and then finish up with just some information on how you can become a ReEDS user or work with the ReEDS team. So I have this little byline in here that this is not the total history of ReEDS because it's actually been around a long time. And so this quote from this Walter Short paper in 2003 gives you a sense of not only the lifetime of the ReEDS model, but kind of its overall motivation and what we try to use it for. So the quote, "The large scope and focus on today's dominant conventional energy forms and existing models do not allow detailed treatment of the more important issues for wind energy technologies," really kind of hints at the idea that at the time, wind was the predominant kind of emerging renewable energy technology, and existing tools looking at long-term plans for the electric sector, didn't feel they did a great job at representing that technology. And so this is just kind of demonstrating that, all along the way, ReEDS is being built to really try to capture emerging trends in the electric sector and understand, what these, new technologies can do to, decarbonize or facilitate other future electric sector goals. And so this is a bit of a timeline showing some major milestones in ReEDS. Obviously, there are a lot more than this that we couldn't fit on a slide, or you wouldn't want to read on a slide. But just to give a sense of where we've come from, like many things in our analysis world, it actually started as a spreadsheet tool. But then over time, increased investment from the Department of Energy ended up in the conversion to an optimization model, which was originally, like on the previous slide, designed just for wind. So it's called the Wind Deployment System, which was formally presented in 2003 at American Wind Energy Association conference. It became ReEDS later in 2008 with the addition of new technologies like CSP and solar photovoltaic. And then a few years later is when we really started to kick off a lot of the really big flagship studies being used, that ReEDS is being used for. And that really kind of started with the Renewable Electricity Futures study. In 2017, we actually rebuilt the model from the ground up, completely recoded it to make it more versatile from a development standpoint, and again, to make sure we can kind of stay current with capturing new technologies. And then a big milestone is in 2019, where it first became an open access tool where analysts, researchers, anyone outside of the NREL ecosystem could actually more easily access and use the ReEDS model. And then the last thing here I just wanted to point out is what I consider kind of a major advancement in that now we're thinking of ReEDS more, increasingly for use in like regional or state level detailed deep dive studies. And so we've recently added a lot of spatial and temporal flexibility to do that. The ReEDS team is very big and it's been growing for a long time. And so, this slide is really just to acknowledge that, I'm being a face to talk to you about REEDS today, but I do a very small fraction of the work that is going on and it goes into this model. So just really need to acknowledge the broader team in all of this. So what does ReEDS do? This is going to be a pretty high level overview because you could probably spend a good hour talking about any one feature in the model when it comes down to it. But I hope this gives a good sense of the model and kind of what goes in, what comes out. So at its core, ReEDS is intended to look at several decades out into the future and understand what the electricity mix is going to be in the United States. And so it's looking at the long-term build out and operation of generation, storage, transmission, and more recently, carbon mitigation technologies as well. And so it's taking into account competition amongst all different types of technologies, um, all across the different types of grid infrastructure. And what it's really doing is looking at the kind of overall system level least cost solution for investing and operating those grid assets in order to meet all of the requirements of the system. And so that obviously includes meeting electricity demand, but there's also requirements to meet capacity requirements for resource adequacy and operating reserves. That's the kind of ancillary services. We're maintaining things like transmission constraints and physical constraints on resources. And then another big usage of ReEDS that talk more about later is policies and regulations. And so we want to make sure that we're representing realistic policies that exist today or potentially future policies that could exist. And so we have to start with the existing infrastructure. And so ReEDS is a very data intensive model. And so this is just giving a sense of we have to build a full database of the power plants in the United States. We have to incorporate transmission information. And this map is just showing the diversity and spatial heterogeneity of those types of resources. We have to think about future projections of electricity demand. And so we can look at different scenarios, low or medium or high growth. And in the model, this is all broken down regionally. And then we do take into account, intra-annual temporal effects. And so we need to account for how load profiles are different across different times of the year and in different scenarios. And so this is just showing some examples where you're thinking about different electrification scenarios, and that not only changes quantity of demand, but also when that demand exists. And then another big input is future projections of technology costs and performance. And so ReEDS has a lot of detail of different types of technologies, but also categories and resource classes. And it's really important to capture what the future costs and performance of those technologies would be. And for that, we generally rely on another one of NREL's flagship products, which is the annual technology baseline. We're the National Renewable Energy Lab, and ReEDS was, like I said, built to do what we think is a better job or a very good job at capturing renewable energy trends in particular. So one of the things that we're really built up to do is to capture hourly and highly spatially resolved information on renewable energy potential, and that comes from largely the REV model, which stands for renewable energy potential in engineer iconography. But so that's giving us temporal availability as well as spatial availability, for different scenarios. For example, more or less access to resources or siting limitations, and so on. We also need to think about, like I said before, policies, right? So we're taking into account clean energy standards, renewable portfolio standards, any kind of emissions caps that exist or could exist. And then, more recently, things like national policies like the Inflation Reduction Act or air emission standards and so on. And so these are all getting factored into the model when we're looking at potential electricity futures. So those are some of the key inputs. Now, on the output side, at its core, what we're really looking at is the capacity and generation mix. Here is showing just an illustrative example for the national capacity and generation mix in a scenario with a lot of decarbonization. And so you've got a lot of wind in blue and solar in yellow. That is accompanied by a lot of batteries, storage in these pink colors. See a drop off of the gas, a build out of, in this case, things like hydrogen turbines. And this is just an example of a type of generation mix. What's not shown here is that, we're also able to look at this, at a regional or local level. Often we run the model with 134 balancing areas, but we can now look at the county level for certain regions in the US. So we're looking at these generation mixes and how they vary in different parts of the country. And then we also need to think about firm capacity. And so, particularly our variable renewables are not always available. So we need to think about when we have capacity at the times of peak electricity demand or peak net demand, when you might not have as much of those renewables available. And then we also think about operating reserve capacity as well. So what do you have to kind of maintain spinning to be able to respond to any grid disturbances? On the transmission side, we're looking, in aggregate, things like how much transmission is built to, complement the infrastructure for generation and storage that's being built. And we can look at, alternating current or AC transmission capacity or direct current DC capacity, different categories, potential for increasing interties between Eastern, Western Texas interconnects and so on. So lots of different options there. And then we often have, a set of metrics that we're looking at associated with those different electricity sector futures. So economics are an obvious one to explore. And so one of our key metrics we think about are the total system costs. And so this is net present value of kind of the all-in investment and operation costs across a whole study period, example from 2022 to 2050. And that gives you a sense of kind of high level costs that you can use to compare across different scenarios. We also often think about, electricity price metrics as well. So you can take a wholesale, operator or marketer perspective and understand, the value and prices associated with energy or load balancing or reserves and so on. You can look at cost breakdowns over time as well. But then you can also take more of a consumer perspective. And so we can post-process this information and use known estimations of, rate base for power sector and, understand what the different scenarios might look like in terms of retail rates as well. And then other important metrics are obviously on the environmental side. And so, we have the generation mix. And so from that, we can get different types of emissions metrics, carbon dioxide, methane, sulfur dioxide, nitrous oxides. And then following from that, we can make assessments of health impacts. And so we can use, EPA expected numbers for, mortality and morbidity and costs associated with that, and then understand what future health impacts look like as well. And then increasingly things like this can be looked at the regional level and think about equity and justice impacts. And there's some non-NREL researchers doing a lot of good work in that space too. So there's a lot of different ways that we're able to use the outcomes from the ReEDS model to explore, trade-offs in these future scenarios for the electric sector. The last thing I kind of want to point out in this section is just to highlight, again, that ReEDS is continually being developed to study these emergency. In some ways, resource adequacy conditions are an active area research, but emerging grid trends is what I meant to say. And so one of the things I want to emphasize is, in addition to the core model infrastructure that has that actually uses kind of a reduced form time slice representation. There's over 200 time slices subannual that we use to capture dynamics of load and renewable energy, but we also use multi-year hourly data sets to do things like characterize capacity credit or how much renewable and storage is available, capacity is available at stress periods or peak demand periods. And then we also use these hourly data to better characterize renewable energy curtailment. And so these figures are just kind of giving some examples of what that looks like. I mentioned this before, but one of the other things is we have different subtypes, vintages, performance classes, and resource classes for most different technologies, particularly renewables. And so, like for example, I actually work a lot in hydropower space, and we have like capacity available at non-powered dams and pumped hydro and dispatchable hydropower, non-dispatchable hydropower. So there's a lot of different details in here that are obvious at the top level, but we're using to try to understand kind of the value and the trade-offs and the different operational behaviors of different technologies. And like I mentioned before, now we have the flexibility to define ReEDS all the way down to county level resolution, and you can actually do hourly resolution within the main model if you have a smaller system that you're studying, to get it within computational limits. And so we're now able to have a lot of flexibility around looking, doing regional case studies and looking at higher resolution results. And then another more recent development is the addition or inclusion of endogenous representations of carbon dioxide and hydrogen production, transport, and storage. And so that allows us to look at new scenarios around carbon management and decarbonization that are utilizing things like carbon capture and storage, electrolysis to make hydrogen that you could use to produce power for meeting peak electricity demand and have it be dispatchable, and all these different types of interactions. And so to give some examples of how ReEDS is being used, I just have a few slides to kind of walk through some flagship studies just to give a sense of what we use ReEDS for. And so one of the key things that ReEDS has been used for over the years is looking at really increasingly decarbonized electricity sector pathways. And so an earlier example of that is this 20% wind study, which was in some ways meant to debunk some initial myths around inoperability of the grid with 20% or more wind. But that evolved into the Renewable Electricity Futures Study, where you're looking at 80% of renewable electricity by 2050, and then going forward to zero carbon systems by 2050, by 2035. And so we're always trying to kind of push the thinking of what might be possible and what that could look like. We also do a lot of studies that are very technology focused. So looking at the implications of innovation in wind energy or hydropower, electrification. So on the demand side, things like electric vehicles and building electrification, and as well as storage technologies as well. Some other things that we've done with ReEDS that I just wanted to highlight are, think about interactions beyond the electric sector. And so, obviously, the electric sector is being thought of as one of the key or maybe earlier sectors to decarbonize. But we have a lot of ongoing and past work to look at things like how the electric sector interfaces with the water sector and how climate change affects both. We've linked ReEDS with broader economy models, general equilibrium models to understand sort of the role it can play when you're accounting for feedbacks with other sectors, transportation, agriculture, all of these things. I have a couple slides that I want to focus on the standard scenarios because that's one of our real flagship major products that we're producing with the ReEDS model. And so 2023 is actually the 9th edition of this report, and that we release annually to look at kind of that year's snapshot of what a range of possible electricity futures for the US might look like. And so that includes a report. We have an online web tool that you can use to explore data and results. And then another bit of analysis that happens with the standard scenarios is we actually take some of the scenarios and run them through an hourly production cost model uh, and get results at a higher temporal resolution. And then we can use those hourly results to look at things like hourly marginal emissions rates and how that vary by region, by year, time of day, day of year. And so that helps you to understand things like, if I bought an electric vehicle and I'm going to charge it at night versus during the day at work, what are the actual emissions implications of that under different scenarios, in my region, and answer those types of questions. What does the standard scenarios look like? So there's a lot going on this slide because I didn't want to take time to spend too many slides on this, but this is just to give you a sense of, we use a wide range of different scenarios in this report. It looks at, policy options, different fossil fuel prices, different technology availability options, both for generation, storage, transmission, demand scenarios, technology cost and performance. And it's producing a range of different grid mixes, emission scenarios, cost scenarios. And it's just a really good example of how ReEDS can be used to do this kind of broader look at possibilities and scenario futures. And I don't know the latest count of scenarios in this report, but I know it's been in the 70 something range lately. And then the last thing I want to point out here is that ReEDS is increasingly being used by other people. So there's a lot of, since we've been open access, there's been, increasingly increasing body of work and a lot of really interesting applications that people are using. And here's in no real, for no real preference or anything like that, but here's just a few examples just to give a range of the types of applications. And so here's, looking at using it for a regional study of wind on the mid-continent or MISO system operator. Here's an example, thinking about how ReEDS can be used to inform decisions around rural electric co-ops, or looking at, and this is the example that I kind of hinted at before, where the model's being used to look at kind of equity and justice impacts associated with air pollution. There's other people that are using ReEDS, in some ways similar to what NREL would do, looking at kind of different options for power sector decarbonization. Here's an example being used in some PhD research for similar decarbonization type analysis. And then here's really cool, where somebody actually was able to take the model and tailor it to an Indonesia power system. And so, at its core, if you're able to produce all of the required input data for, for the model itself, it is certainly possible to apply ReEDS to different different countries, or do it in a different way for regional studies. And we internally have done that. I don't have slides on this, but we have done that for India, and essentially created a whole different code base for that. But that is one of the things that even internally we're kind of actively thinking about, is sort of how to make the model more readily, I guess, adaptable to different systems in different countries. I think I might have even gone too fast, but I'm almost done here before we can just go to Q&A. But the last couple of things I just want to point out is sort of how can you become a user of ReEDS? And there's really two main ways. One is, you can go and download and use the model itself. So you can go to our webpage that links over to the GitHub site. You can clone this repository. All of the source code, all of the input data is fully open, downloadable. You can do whatever you want with it. Though I will point out that we run ReEDS in the code. The core model is in GAMS, and we typically use a solver called Cplex to solve the model. And both GAMS and Cplex do require licenses to be able to run a model of the size of our kind of default representation of ReEDS. But again, the code is certainly fully available, and this is also something that we're continually thinking about, sort of the best path forward, so that we can make this as kind of open and transparent and usable for others as we can. And then the other way to, be a ReEDS user and involved with the ReEDS team is to partner with NREL. And so there's a lot of different ways to do that. You could certainly, if you know people on the team or at NREL, or just want to see what different types of technologies and projects people are involved in, you can connect with staff directly. There's information on the NREL website about different types of partnerships and how they can be structured contractually. But then there's also, internship or obviously, job opportunities that you could think about taking advantage of to get more involved with the ReEDS team. And then, if there's an external funding opportunity through really Department of Energy or anywhere where you think it might make sense to collaborate with the ReEDS team. You can certainly get in touch with us and we can talk about what the possibilities and the options are there. NREL does a lot of work for the U.S. Department of Energy and federal government, but we're always interested in exploring opportunities for how our work and how our expertise can make an impact more broadly than that. So really the last thing I want to just sort of summarize a few things is, I think I've mentioned this in several ways before already, but the idea and the goal with the ReEDS model is that it's continually evolving, and it's a versatile tool to look at a wide range of futures, using it, lots of different kind of performance, economic, environmental, and other types of metrics to respond to whatever pressing questions that we have about the future electricity system. Over time, we've continually added a lot of advanced features, particularly to study things like renewable energy and other decarbonization related things. And so, just for example, there's a really nice paper that was published, I think a year or so ago, about our representation of the Inflation Reduction Act. And there's a lot of nuances when those policies get on the books, and that's a very non-trivial exercise. And so that's one of the things that we really put a lot of time and effort into staying on top of. And then just lastly, kind of going back last couple of slides is you can become a ReEDS user by downloading the code or working with the ReEDS team. And we're always interested to talk about ideas and opportunities for doing that. So that is all I have for slides. And I think we have plenty of time for questions. I do see there's a few in the chat already.
It does indeed look like we have about 4 questions so far. So for let's see, for Lindsay, she said she notices one of the papers using ReEDS was about Indonesia. How can it be used for other international energy research?
Yeah, I mean, I got into this a little bit because I did kind of see that question on that slide. But I would say, ReEDS is very, because it is very data intensive, and a lot of the structures and kind of constraints and things like that are tailored for the US. It is not easy to adapt it for another country, but it is certainly possible with like a motivated user. If you're able to have data sets, you want to turn off constraints that maybe aren't applicable. If you have a strong kind of coding and development background or good in GAMS, then it's certainly possible to do that. But yeah, I would say that one of the things that internally we're discussing increasingly is what we can do to make the model more readily adaptable for other countries, because I think there's an appetite for that kind of work. That we and others want to do. And we're starting to make inroads, and part of the idea behind like spatial and temporal flexibility is to start to get at that. And now we're working on things like kind of separating the input structures, so they're a bit more independent of the model constraints, and just trying to make it so that it's easier to do that. But it's certainly a work in progress.
All right. So moving on to question number 2 from Michael. He said, in the scenario viewer at the state level, is there any way for users to attribute changes to net generation to in-state power demand versus electricity produced and sent to other states in the transmission grid?
Yeah, so that's doing that can be a little tricky. So there's nothing on this scenario viewer that has that information, I don't think. But basically what you would want would be the power flows. So um, the model does have a transmission overlay and it uses a pipe flow representation. So, it's not like a DC power flow or something like that. We actually did some tests and wrote a paper comparing them, and it didn't make much difference, at least the 134 balancing area level of aggregation. But what I would say is that if you're interested in getting some of that data, you could potentially contact us and we could pull the transmission flow data from whatever scenarios you're interested in, and we could pass that along. The attribution is tricky, right? Because ReEDS is a model. It's high, it's aggregated. It's not representing all market structures and institutions and policies that do have a big impact, and contracts that do impact real world power flows. And so there's a lot of uncertainty in doing that. But effectively the model does represent those flows. And you could do things like make some kind of proportional sharing assumption, and we've done this in the past, to kind of say that like if how much electricity in one region is being used in another region. And it's so the answer is that we have the data. There are ways to approximate. It's not perfect, but if you want to see something specific, probably just contact us.
All right. Let's see. Question number 3 comes from Avi. He said, is it possible, or they said, is it possible to show some simple cases while running or using ReEDS to showcase different scenarios?
I'm not set up to it. It's not quite fast enough to do like a real time. It's not like a web tool. We do we could you can run cases within a few minutes if you just run like small subregions, like a couple states or so. Um, but the purpose of this webinar was more to give kind of an overview than like the how to use ReEDS experience. But we do host an annual user group meeting that is much more directed towards people that are actively or want to actively use ReEDS. Um, don't know when the next one would be offhand, but that's what I would say. I would encourage you to keep an eye out for that, and that's more of like a training type environment for like how to actually open it up and get things running and so on.
Next question. This person's interested in knowing about the retail rate modeling and if you can elaborate on that and how detailed it is.
I'd have to admit, I'm not really the expert in that module. The person who designed and built a lot of that is named Peter Gagnon. He also runs our standard scenario analysis in ReEDS right now. So, it's coming up here. Let me just go back to the slide. So, I mean, it is coming up with, regionally resolved estimates of these retail rates. I know, it's basically you can kind of get a sense of how it's starting with the system cost data, right? And then annualizing that and distributing it over capital depreciation. And then we'll use historical data to come up with expected adders for things like distribution, administration, and all of this stuff. Again, this is bias correction is like a calibration factor. And so, yeah, there's a lot of, estimations, approximations involved in all of this. I would never go out and say like ReEDS predicts that this is what is going to be on your bill in 2040, right? But the idea of this is to layer into the raw results the cost components that, or the components that go into retail rates that aren't endogenously modeled in ReEDS, and then be able to compare them across different scenarios. So that you could say like, well, maybe retail rates would be, 5% higher or 5% lower in this or that scenario. And you can do that at the, the regional level. You would, what I don't know is sort of what, I'm assuming this is kind of an annualized estimate. I don't think it's accounting for things like different rate structures, and I don't think we really have the ability to do that. But yeah, I hope that answers your question. It's about the level of detail that I am able to get into. And maybe if you want to get in touch, I could put you in touch with Peter, and he could definitely explain it in a lot greater detail.
All right, our next question is from Akash. He said, I could see a recent survey that 90% of clean electricity across the US is still waiting to get into the grid. What's your takeaway from this, and how could ReEDS help with this?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to offer any color commentary on the issue of interconnection queues being too long to get things built, but I would say that, you could use ReEDS to think about those types of issues. And the way you might do that, there's a couple ways you might do that. You might have um, one of the first things off the top of my head is we do have the ability to implement growth constraints. And so there's a lot of switches and reads to turn things on and off or toggle things around. And one of those is growth constraints. So you can say like you can only build this many megawatts per year in a given region or something, or you could say that you can only grow by like X% a year. And you could use that to represent some of the friction in things like interconnection queues or even like supply chains and stuff like that. Um, or you could add new constraints that represent something specific. So, you could use the model to say to run scenarios with and without more kind of friction in getting things built, and then use that to start a conversation around like what are the implications of that. Uh, okay, so William's asking if we partner with nonprofit environmental organizations, and if so, is funding required? Yes, and yes. Yeah, so just without getting into much detail of like how NREL partnerships truly work, like we bill hours to tasks, and so to do substantive work, there needs to be some sort of project and collaboration, and so that's why one of the bullets in that slide is about kind of finding like funding and proposal opportunities so we can work together. But uh, there's no inherent restrictions on like what types of organizations that we would work with. Obviously it has to, meet it has to be in line with our mission and what we're trying to accomplish. But there's certainly examples of working with nonprofits, and we've done like foundation funded work in the past. Like I mentioned, the ReEDS for India, a lot of that work is actually funded by a nonprofit foundation, or has been in the past.
Thanks for answering that one, Stuart. Sorry, I was a little slow on the draw on that one.
Oh, that's okay.
Um, all right, next one comes from
Oh,
Jim. Yeah, we got a few questions. We got
yeah, I'll try to
about
answer
20 minutes
quickly. We got
left.
a lot.
Yep. We have about 20 minutes left, but Jim was asking if the software comes with the data and how it's adjusted and updated.
Yeah, so I do have the GitHub up. So all of the data is in here. It's probably a little small, but if you go into input data, you can go right into our everything in here, and there is some summary. This is going to look obtuse if you've never looked at stuff before, but there is kind of some summary files up at the high level. But for example, like you can just go right here, like, well, I guess you can't view it because it's too big, but like you can download the generator database. It's just right there. And so as we update the model internally and push code changes, that will often come with data updates as well. And so there will be a history on here of those updates and tags uh, and what's changed. Explain type of model.
Yep. Yeah, and Ariel was wondering if you could explain type of optimization models and model size. Would it require decomposition or solution strategy?
Yeah, so it's just a linear program. So we actually don't have any integer variables in here. It's, kind of millions of constraints and variables as a linear program. And so it would certainly be possible for someone to take this, add some integer constraints if they want to do things like uh, fixed like capacity sizes or things like that. Um, but yeah, it is generally, if when you're running national studies with a lot of bells and whistles, it's pretty computationally intensive just as an LP. So we haven't done a lot of experimentation with integer and nonlinear constraints.
All right, next question from Jim. He's asking how ReEDS replaced 1 megawatt of thermal capacity with renewable capacity. Is it a 1-for-1 or is it greater than 1-for-1?
Yeah, so the objective in ReEDS is to minimize system costs, and so it's not saying it's not saying that like you're gonna replace any one thing for another. So it's definitely not necessarily one to one. If you what you might be getting at is sort of the fact that renewables are not always a variable or available at all times of day. Um, and so that's what gets into this like firm capacity requirement. So in addition to meeting electricity demand, you have to meet capacity requirements at all times of year for resource adequacy. And so if you look closely, you'll see that this kind of firm capacity expectation in this example is there's not that much, like the wind here is actually going to be a lot less than the total capacity, and the solar is basically zero in the winter period. And so that's how we're kind of accounting for the idea that it's not just one to one, and it depends on system operation and where you build it and what you build it. And we can compare across scenarios that if there's less thermal, what is built instead? And generally, yeah, you would see more renewable. If it's variable renewable, you'd see more built on a capacity basis to satisfy the same amount of energy that the thermals will be building. But if that's the cost optimal solution, that's the cost optimal solution. Yeah.
So yeah, Rom is asking how the demand side module is integrated to the supply side from 2023 ReEDS version. Is it primarily coming from EIA NEMS, or are there any modifications to that data set? And if so, what are the key variables from the NEMS demand module that are fed into ReEDS for optimization?
Yeah, so uh, starting this year and maybe last year, we actually are more using data sets that we've built in partnership with Evolved Energy Resources that start as um, hourly load projections over multiple years under different kind of reference case and electrification futures. Um, and so increasingly we're using that because we feel that it does a better job at capturing emerging trends on the demand side and electric vehicles and building electrification. And so when that hits ReEDS, it's just a fixed exogenous data set, but it's basically a multi-year hourly data set that gets aggregated to whatever time resolution and spatial resolution that you're using in the model, and you'll have default scenarios and different options for demand growth. And so we've been moving away a little bit from the EIA load projections to some alternatives, just to give a broader range of possible outcomes.
Right. William had another question. He was asking if the model incorporates predicted demand response aspects like real-time pricing, tiered consumption pricing, and load control via DER context.
Yeah, so ReEDS takes the perspective of kind of a wholesale, a bulk electricity system, kind of wholesale operator. And so there aren't constructs for things like time of use rates and pricing. But what we do have is the ability to kind of carve out a portion of the demand and say that it's flexible and can be optimized. And so that's another kind of lever you can pull in the on the demand side, is to say like, what degree of demand flexibility do you expect? And then it just lets the model move demand around to be more economic.
Right, next question comes from Adam. He said there's a mention of the NREL Rev model for those interested in modeling expansion of single tech. What model is preferred, ReEDS or Rev?
Yeah, so they're not equivalent models. Rev is basically a like a geospatial tool that's used to develop um, the renewable energy uh, resource potential and profile data that goes into ReEDS.
And from
So
James,
sorry if that wasn't
oh,
clear
sorry.
before.
Um, all right. Next from James, do you have any case studies in ERCOT in general regarding the aggregated DER programs? You said specifically, like ideally ERCOT's ADER pilot.
I don't know of anything specific on that. I'm not familiar with those pilots. I mean, you certainly could do it, right? Like I said, we've got scenario levers for demand flexibility. You could choose to only model ERCOT. You could tinker with those scenario definitions and play around that with that yourself. So that's one of the reasons like why we want to get this out in the world, because there are specific case study examples that we might not necessarily be looking at, but others could take the model and run with it.
Avi had a follow-up to their last question, asking how about Reed's training on YouTube or webinar that NREL maybe already has.
Oh yeah, yeah, we definitely. I should have probably mentioned that. Yeah, you can find me and others in many past years giving webinars on our REEDS user group meetings. Let me see if I can find that reasonably quickly. But yeah, if you go on NREL's YouTube channel, you should be able to find lots of recordings from past REITs user group meetings, and that could get into some of the, more specifics of, you know, how to set up your like Python environment and all that stuff, and like actually get going and run the model.
All right. Um, Barbara was wondering if you could compare it to CEM within Sienna, um, also with Engage. Um, One of the things, Sienna is a great tool to answer, just to answer this question. It's, what can be done with interconnection queues is, I guess, kind of a broader question here.
Wait, which um, you want me to start with Barbara's question about
Yeah.
other models? Yeah. Um, so REEDS versus Sienna versus Engage. So, Sienna is I don't know a whole lot about a lot of the details of Sienna's investment modeling capabilities. I've talked to, some of that team a little bit about it. My understanding is that they're generally geared towards very localized, specific case study applications. Um, and the model isn't really built out to consider, large national scale scenarios that are really involving all possible technology options and all existing policies. And so REEDS is definitely much more built up to do like large scale applied analysis, um, wh- while also having a lot of the versatility, kind of add new constraints, data, and new scenarios, and so on. Whereas I think Sienna's uh, generally directed towards more of kind of smaller scale things right now, and also the ability to do those in a context where you can more readily drill down to things like all the way down to, like detailed power flow and AC power flow type analysis. Uh, Engage is, um, a much more has much. it's much more easy to use and versatile for even things like, international applications. But it is not, it does not have the level of functionality and detail as ReEDS does. And so it can be a good place to start, but there might be just um, kind of hard functionality limitations to represent some of the details. And I don't think it goes into nearly as much detail as a model like ReEDS or even Sienna might on, kind of the spatial and temporal variability aspects, storage operation, all those kind of emerging grid features.
Thanks
What is the
for
next one
sharing
that
that.
you want me to go
Next,
to?
let's go to this question from Allison. It's a
Yeah.
twofer. Um, she asked, is the model ready to run slash study a virtual utility study at the sub-county level? And the 2021 storage study is a bit outdated. Is this updated in ReEDS 2.0?
Um, so county level is the highest resolution that we have available right now. And so when you run reads, it's using raw kind of transmission data to then aggregate to like transmission corridors between whatever region set that you're using, and it kind of does that as an initial step before the model starts running. And so we're not set up to be able to run all the way down to like a nodal resolution. So that would be like an example where like Sienna from the previous question might be better suited to do that level of spatial detail. And so I wouldn't say that uh, you could go sub-county and look at things quite that level of resolution. But if it's like a utility that's covering a few states, right? And you want to get a sense of the generation mix in that region, then I think it'd be well suited for that. And as far as the storage study being outdated, so the storage technology representation has certainly been updated since 2021. Both the technology cost, performance, a lot of the temporal flexibility has given us the capabilities to look at longer durations and longer duration storage and start to think about um, what kind of role that might play. And so while the study itself is a few years old, the representation has continued to improve. And then it's just sort of DOE only funds these major technology studies on a given technology every so often. So I wouldn't expect necessarily like a Storage Futures 2.0 anytime really soon, but you could certainly take the model and run similar scenarios with update versions and see what the differences are. Yeah.
All right, we have about 5 minutes left, so I'm not sure we're going to be able to get through everybody's questions, but we can go through as fast as possible. Next one is how are emission and health impacts calculated, and are those functions provided within ReEDS, or do you use some other tools to answer those?
Yeah, so those are post-processing calculations. So the emissions are, really just a direct result of whatever the generation solution is and the emissions rates of the technologies that are being used. So that's kind of a part of the model. And then the health impacts is just like a post-processing, there's X dollars associated with each ton of emissions, and those are just kind of multiplying factors that get used. And I don't, I don't have off the top of my head sort of like the citations and resources, but they should be in the ReEDS documentation. And the person that built a lot of that is Brian Sergi, and he could go into a lot more detail around the health impacts calculations.
All right, next question. How does the ReEDS model future growth of distributed energy resources like virtual power plants?
I'm not sure what you mean by virtual power plants, but so distributed energy resources uh, are taken into account typically through exogenous projections. So to date, we've only really um, incorporated projections of distributed PV. And so there's a model called DGen that is a consumer adoption model that does different scenarios for distributed PV projections. And that actually becomes an input to the ReEDS model so that we're including that, uh, the impact of that injection of PV onto the grid. And so, future work could do other things like distributed solar or distributed wind and so on.
Uh, See, we got another one from Avi. Have you tested the accuracy from past future studies to understand how good, fair, bad the assumptions uh, were then, and to retweak those assumptions for, I guess, current and future use?
Yeah, so there was a study done a few years back that did kind of a historical retrospective and compared ReEDS results to um, others, and you could find it on the NREL's page. I mean, this is the title, if you want to Google that and find a better link. But yeah, so we have done some of that work. Obviously all models are ROG, some are useful. This one is never perfect. Um, but we have used that to think about, how we might do some adjustments to better match reality and things like uh, capacity credit or capacity reserve requirements and so on.
All right. So we're just about out of time here. Stuart, if you wouldn't mind advancing the to the next slide, please. But thank you everybody for your questions. Sorry we couldn't get to all of them. But just so you guys know, we're going to be back again on June 11th at 10 a.m. Mountain Time. That's noon Eastern for our Powered by Sienna webinar. That's going to be led by NREL grid researcher Clayton Barrows. He helped develop the Sienna modeling tool. It's open source simulation and optimization for modern energy systems. Again, that's going to be June 11th at 10 a.m. Mountain Time, noon Eastern. So with that, we can kind of end it a couple minutes early here. Stuart, thank you so much for your time answering all those questions and for the presentation. You did excellent work. And with that, we can say goodbye.
Cool. Thanks, everyone. I was trying to hammer out a couple in the Q&A and chat before we go, but feel free to be in touch, email if you have more questions, and try to answer as best we can. But thanks for joining.